Welcome back. I decided to sit for a while because I was getting kind of tired. I hope you don't mind. Now we're going to talk about Hezekiah again. The thing with Hezekiah was he was one of Israel's very best kings. Judah. I need to get that straight. It's Judah. And I want to clarify again. Here we have the northern tribes, the 10 tribes that have gone north, and that's called Israel. And we have the 2 southern tribes, which are Judah and Benjamin. So hopefully I can say this correctly because I'm so used to just saying the word Israel. But Hezekiah was king of Judah, of Benjamin and Judah. And there had been all this stuff that was going on with Assyria and the various kings. Now, Hezekiah was making an alliance with Syria, but it was a temporary alliance. And it was one that he was making out of the need to buy time. And the reason he needed to buy time was so that he could reinforce the walled city of Jerusalem. He needed to, as we were talking last time, he needed to secure the water supply. He needed to reinforce the walls. He needed to make sure that the inhabitants, the citizens of Jerusalem were protected. And so he had made this alliance with Sennacherib, that he would buy friendship. Now, you know how it is. A friendship purchased is never a good friendship. And so Sennacherib sends his henchman in, and his henchman is Rabshakeh, who is probably, he speaks the Hebrew language. Now, our Bibles call it Judean, but it's Hebrew. And because he speaks it fluently, it gives us a real good indication that possibly he was a Jew who had been captured or possibly converted to whatever the Assyrian language, language and culture and spiritual background was at the time. Anyhow, he was the one chosen by Sennacherib to come and to tout the plea to Hezekiah to taunt the people. And so this is where we pick up with the story now. His whole point is to terrify the citizenry of Jerusalem. Now, Sennacherib made some demands. The first demand he made was that, through his emissary, because he wasn't there, remember, he's off at war somewhere else. So he through Rabshakeh and his cohorts, they demand 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Well, that's a lot of money. Hezekiah emptied the royal treasury as well as the temple treasury. He even removed the gold overlay from the temple doors, which he had installed to replace already missing gold. Now, if you remember, during the time of his father, King Ahaz, he had stripped the treasury then, and he had stripped it of the gold and everything else. And so Hezekiah, in his desire to rebuild the temple, not to physically rebuild the building, but to clean it up and to make sure everything was proper, he had put a new gold overlay on the temple doors. And now he needed that gold. He needed every dime of silver and gold he could get his hand on to pay this ransom, if you will, to Sennacherib via his henchman, Rabshakeh. So Rabshakeh, whose name means chief cupbearer and is probably a former Judean, has been captured or surrendered. At any rate, he spoke what I already said. He spoke Judean, which is Hebrew. So in Isaiah 37, verses 16 through 18, we see where he rides up to the walls of Jerusalem, which are extremely well fortified now, and he starts calling to the people in Hebrew, mocking Hezekiah and telling them that he has left them without protection from their God, since he tore down the high places. Now, what Rabshakeh is saying here is, because Hezekiah took down all these altars where people went and they worshipped and made sacrifices to these idols. So Rabshakeh is saying that Hezekiah has left them vulnerable. He's not giving any credence at all to this one true God of Israel. He's not giving any credence at all to the possibility that this one true God of Israel would provide the rescue and the resources that they needed. He's just saying, hey, Chuck, you guys are without protection because you tore down the idols. Why does anybody worship an idol anyway? I mean, you know, you just figured out. You make this little device here. This is a replica of some of the pottery that they've found in Israel. And you make this little device with your hands. I mean, you get the clay, you get it wet, you form it like this, you let it dry, you bake it so it's hard, and then you put it on a shelf and worship it? Good grief. But we do that, don't we? We worship at our TV stations. We worship at our iPads, our computers. Oh my gosh, our computers are great places of worship. We worship our cars, our homes, our yards, mowing the yard on Sunday or on Shabbat. We do things that we don't really have the right to sit in judgment. We just need to think about, is this something that we do? So Rabshakeh referred to King Hezekiah as Hezekiah, refusing to honor his title because Sennacherib, the great king, and Rabshakeh says it's God's will that Sennacherib overthrow Judah. Don't you just love it? When somebody says, well, it's God's will. Well, I think, well, who died appointed you God to begin with? You know, that kind of stuff just irritates me. Somebody said the other day that a particular person, if they voted for a particular person, there was a hot place in hell for them. I think, well, who made you the judge and jury and all that stuff? So anyhow, Eliakim is one of Hezekiah's trusted servants. And Eliakim, appeals to Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, which is the language that he understood. Eliakim was an educated man. He spoke Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic. And he's saying to Rabshakeh, hey, speak to us in Aramaic. We understand that. And Rabshakeh says, get over yourself. It's these little guys that I'm speaking to up here. It's them I want their attention, because as soon as they figure out what's going on, you're toast. Well, he wants them to surrender and fear. And then Rabshakeh tells the people that they need to surrender for their own good. If it will go easier on them if they surrender without a fight, Assyrians move. He says they'll live in peace and prosperity elsewhere. Well, as I said previously on the earlier lesson, it was the ideology or the thought process of the Assyrians to pluck up the people that they defeated and move them over here to another land, to Assyria or somewhere else. Because when you do that, you uproot them and you take away their loyalty to that land. We haven't seen that in the last few years, have we? As we've seen aliens come in from other parts of the country or world, we see them come in and demand that they have their customs along with them. Yeah, I know I'm interfering. Rabshakeh makes his claims and answers even louder so the people can hear and be in fear. He issues then an insult, absolute insult to Hezekiah. He says, hey, Hezi, we're ready to give you 2,000 horses here if you've got enough men to put on them. So he's saying to Hezekiah, we're huge. We're so huge that we can give up 2,000 horses, and you're so small that you can't even put 2,000 men on them. So I don't have to give them up, because that's part of the problem there. I mean, it's an insult. It's an in-your-face dare. And Rabshakeh tells the Jews to surrender again. He just keeps saying that to them. And then he accused Hezekiah of feigning friendship with Sennacherib in order to buy time to mobilize for battle. Well, part of that's true. Hezekiah did feign a friendship or buy a temporary friendship with Sennacherib in order to give him time to reinforce the city and to get the water where it was safe and to reinforce the walls of the city. Hezekiah warned his enemies to keep quiet, not to respond to any, or his emissaries to keep quiet, not to respond to anything Rabshakeh said. Now, the reason for that was if they responded to Rabshakeh, to his dare, his taunting, if they responded to him in any way, then they could take that. Now, I know it's going to be a little hard for you to understand this today with nobody taking anything out of context, but if they responded to him, he could take whatever they said and twist it and dissect it and use it as a threat. And then that would give the Assyrian army the legal right to attack Judah. Can you imagine that? I mean, where's the détente? Where's all this peaceful stuff we hear about today? And so Hezekiah's emissaries were quiet. They said nothing, other than when Eliakim asked Rabshakeh to please speak in Aramaic. Rabshakeh compared God to his idols and said that God, the one true God, the Jewish God, wasn't capable of standing up to Sennacherib. Well, that's a slap in the face. And Hezekiah's emissaries were so grieved over the ugly words of Rabshakeh that they literally tore their garments over the blasphemy. And then when you tear your garment over a blasphemy, you're not allowed to repair it. So as long as you have that garment, you walk around with it torn. It's a sign of grief. It's a sign of just total disruption in the life of the one who's been insulted like that. And Rabshakeh tells the people that they shouldn't rely on Egypt to come to the rescue because Egypt's military has already been defeated. And there's nothing left, nothing. And it says they are so thin that if you leaned on them now, like you would lean on a reed, you would get a splinter in your hand. I mean, that's insulting Egypt, but he didn't care because that's where Sennacherib is warring, is against Egypt. Well, the thing is, that wasn't true at all. But the people didn't know it. I mean, there's no Channel 9 news flying over the war saying, oh, well, this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening. They just didn't know it. And so he could make these false accusations, and the people were fearful. You would be, I would be. Rabshakeh repeats that it would be futile to oppose him because the gods of the other nations didn't defend them. To oppose whom? To oppose Sennacherib. Because as he fought against these other nations, their gods didn't defend them, and they were defeated. And the 10 tribes worship Jewish God to no avail. He's slamming that in their face. The 10 tribes of Israel worship the same Jewish God. Didn't do them any good, did it? And then he goes on. He says it's useless for them to think about their God rescuing them because it just ain't going to happen. Rabshakeh was guilty of great blasphemy. And this is one of the things that caused the emissaries of Hezekiah to be so grieved. And why? So now Sennacherib comes, and then he has to leave. And so when he leaves, he goes off to fight another war against Cush. And so when he goes to war against Cush, he not only wars with them, but he wins. And so when he wins, he has all these spoils of war. So now here he comes. He's going to come back to Jerusalem, the outskirts of Jerusalem, and he's bringing his military guys up, and they have with them these spoils of war. And, you know, I assume that's household items, silver, gold, whatever they found. I think it was a winner-take-all situation. And they brought it back. You know, they didn't have time to go home and put it in the bank. So they brought it back with them to Jerusalem. And so now you have 185,000 of Sennacherib's troops surrounding this little tiny walled city of Jerusalem. Sennacherib demonstrated great strength over the Cushites. Thus, to the Assyrian reputation of being invincible would be greater than ever. I mean, it's kind of like thinking, oh, Russia's so big. Oh, Russia's so big. We're so afraid. And then we go in and knock the living daylights off them. They weren't so big after all. Yeah, we had a war. Yeah, we had to fight. We had to fight hard, and we lost a lot of lives. But in the end, God prevailed. And that's what's going to happen here. God will prevail. So when they all fell dead at the gates of Jerusalem, the surrounding nations would gain enormous respect for God and Israel. So while Sennacherib and Rabshakeh are saying all these things and proclaiming all these things, God is getting himself positioned for this battle that's coming. And so Hezekiah consults Isaiah, who is his cousin. The prophet is his cousin. He's the main prophet of the era. And he consults him to learn what God's will is in this perilous time. And he says, King Hezekiah says to Isaiah, says to his men, his emissaries, when they go to see Isaiah, he says to them, tell him that Israel's darkest moment has arrived. And Assyria, and one of the prophecies, when Israel's darkest moment would arise, and when Assyria would curse Hashem, which is one of the names of God, then it would be time for God to rally to battle and take down the Assyrians. Eliakim takes the message, Hezekiah's message, to Isaiah, who then sends a messenger asking for prayer, and then he offers sacrifices for the deliverance. He told them to describe 4 aspects of the situation. This is a day of distress. The very survival of the nation was imperiled. It was a day of rebuke, either because the wicked Assyrians proclaimed their absolute power, or because the insolence of Rabshakeh was an indication that God was displeased with Israel because of its sins. It was a day of sacrilege, because Rabshakeh's blasphemies themselves were very painful to the people. And then he said, we're like babies in the birthing canal, but the mother does not have the strength or the energy to push the baby out. It's that dire. And so when they go to, King Hezekiah's emissaries go to Isaiah, those are the 4 points that they point out, that this is definitely the time, the day of distress. Assyria will mock Hashem. And these are the things that are happening. This is what it feels like. Now the Assyrian army was camped outside around the walls of Jerusalem, and they prepared to lay a siege the next day. Now, enter God. You know, when he shows up, it's almost like an earthquake. And so, however, the night before the attack, before the siege, God sent the angel, his archangel, Gabriel, with his instructions to unleash a plague on the Assyrians. That night, the night before the siege, 185,000 Assyrians died surrounding the walls of Jerusalem. They died without any battle going on at all. And Sennacherib, the lone survivor, fled to Nineveh. Wow. Wasn't that something? Now, before all this happened, we saw that when Rabshakeh sends a warning to Hezekiah in writing, the warning says to Hezekiah, you have no chance of survival. Your God was powerless to help you. When Hezekiah got that arrogant message from Sennacherib, Hezekiah put on sackcloth, and he went to the temple, and he took this letter. It was like, he took this letter and he laid it on the altar before God, and he prayed over it. And he said, O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, who is enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and listen to all the words of Sennacherib, who sent them to reproach the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have devastated all the countries and the lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were not gods, but they were the work of men's hands, wood and stone. So they have destroyed them. He reminded God that Sennacherib's desecration of the name of God was an insult to God. Even if Israel did not deserve to be saved on its own merits, God should help his people for the sake of his name. Now, you know how it is when we look through the Torah, how many times Moses argued with God, and Moses said to him, God, this is about you. This is about your name. if you kill the Jews now, then Egypt will say, well, you had to get them out of Egypt to kill them because you didn't want to harm the Egyptian people. And he constantly, Moses and God had this argument going. It's like God needed to be reminded that he was supreme, and that what would people say issue there. Sometimes you think, oh, who cares what people say? Well, it does matter. It matters what nations say. Think about what's happened here in America over the last few years and how the world began to laugh at us because we had become so weakened. And then changes in power, changes in the presidency, and suddenly people are not laughing anymore. They're sucking in air and going, oh my gosh, a real king, a real president has arrived. Well, a real king had arrived, and his name was Hezekiah. But more importantly than the real king was the real God. And the real God was the God of Israel. And no matter how many nations Assyria captured, no matter how many times they said that those gods or those nations didn't do their job, they were worthless to begin with. They were like balloons with no air. They were worthless. And so Hezekiah ends his prayer, and he pleads that God's name be sanctified, and he proved to all that God is the God of the universe. In the answers to Hezekiah's prayer, although both Hezekiah and Isaiah prayed, God responded to Hezekiah's prayer via Isaiah. And it was because the king represents the destiny of the entire nation. So when it's the leader, whether it's a king, president, ambassador, prime minister, whatever his title is, he represents the entire nation. And when he represents the entire nation, there is an even larger burden on his shoulders. And that burden is to walk in righteousness before the one true God. And so in this case, it was the king, King Hezekiah, representing the destiny of the entire nation to the entire world. It wasn't the destiny of the world. It was the destiny of Judah to the world. And when the king is as righteous as Hezekiah was, his prayer is more effective. Now, I know that sometimes we want other people to pray for us because we think that they're more righteous or they have a closer connect to God or something like that. I get amused when I'm in Israel and I see these amazing Jewish men in their long black coats and their big black hats and the payas, and they're out there talking on their cell phones. And my husband used to say, they've got a direct connect to God. Look, they're talking to God on their cell phones. And it was just a little amusing thing we thought. And we said, it wasn't mockery. It was like, wow, they really do have a direct connect. We also have that direct connect through Yeshua. So anyhow, the answer from God to Isaiah for King Hezekiah was, the enemies will be beaten without a fight. Sennacherib will go away in a simple manner without dignity, no dignity. God will take care that Sennacherib's army, are destroyed. Sennacherib will fail in Egypt. And when Sennacherib comes home, he will be punished by the sword. Well, that's really pretty strong, isn't it? Pretty strong. Now, when God issues something like that, you have the option of believing it or disbelieving it. I believe Isaiah believed it, and King Hezekiah believed it too. They had cried out to God in their hour of need. They had sent their request, sent their petition. They were so sure. They were absolutely positive that there was no other answer for them but God. And God said, don't worry, I'll show up. And when I show up, this is what I'm going to do. Not only am I going to wipe out the 185,000 soldiers, which he did in one night with the plague, but he said, I'm going to wipe out Sennacherib as well. Now, Sennacherib has been running around all over the Middle East for quite some time now, like a little banty rooster strutting around, pawing the dirt, fluffing his feathers, acting like he was really going to attack. And he was really not that great. He was great in his own mind. So when these 185,000 soldiers die, Sennacherib doesn't die. He leaves. Now, whether he left just before that happened, during the happening, or what, I'm not sure of the actual sequence there, but he leaves and he goes to Nineveh. Have you heard of Nineveh? And say Joshua. No, it wasn't Joshua. I was thinking Joshua the Battle of Jericho. It was Jonah. Jonah with Nineveh. And remember how Jonah went to Nineveh and the city was so large it took him 3 days to walk across the city. Well, so where does Sennacherib go? He goes to Nineveh. And why Nineveh? Maybe he had a kingship there, but maybe he was hiding out or what. Anyhow, he went to his temple to pray, and he was overheard in his prayer that he wanted to win and that he would be willing to sacrifice his own 2 sons. They either heard the prayer or they got word of the prayer, and so they killed their dad. It was, I guess you could say, it's self-defense. I don't know if they'd stand up in the court of law today or not, but they killed their father, the 2 sons did, and then they fled away. In the meantime, back in Jerusalem, you have 185,000 dead Assyrian soldiers. I don't know what happened to the bodies. Somebody asked me that the other day, and I thought, I don't know. Archaeologists haven't told us that yet. But then Isaiah assured the Jews that Sennacherib and that he would die and they would soon scorn him. Can you imagine yourself being in the position of Sennacherib, thinking that you are above it all? A lot of people think that. I'm sorry, but nobody is above God or his people. Sennacherib thought only he knew the future. Only God knew the future. Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim.